All right, so good morning, everybody in the room and online, and welcome to this award session. So it's my great pleasure and honor, and it was my great pleasure and honor to chair the Luciano Tomassini Latin American International Relations Book Award Committee this year. My name is Brigitte Weiffen. I'm in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the Open University in the United Kingdom. And in the committee, I was joined by a number of colleagues, Claudia Kedar from Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who is joining us online today, Andres Malamud from Universidade de Lisboa, Catherine Marino from University of California, Los Angeles, Victor Mijares, Universidad de los Andes, Colombia, and Arturo Sotomayor from George Washington University. So we were quite a big committee. And we had several meetings. And my introductory comments today will give you an idea of how the committee worked and how it's reached its decision on this year's Luciano Tomassini Award. And of course, this session will also honor the awardee and the honorable mention. And then subsequently, we will hear from Professor Stephen Kaplan himself, who will present his book. Followed by comments from a specialist on the topic. We invited Victoria Ching, who is joining us online as well. And afterwards, there will be time for questions and discussions with the audience, both in the room and online. So be prepared to have some questions and comments. So about the work of the committee, we had a few meetings online and also exchanged via email. And in our first meeting, the committee members agreed on a number of evaluation criteria for the books. One being the pertinence for the award. So was there a clear focus on Latin America? Was there a clear focus on international relations? A second criterion was obviously the academic quality. Was there a clear research question, a gap that was being addressed? How research methods were being applied and justified? Whether the book was consistently structured. And the third criterion we looked at, is it a significant contribution to the field? So is it innovative, original, or offering a new perspective, or addressing new or under-researched topics? And then a fourth criterion that we looked at, simply, is it a good read? Is it something that works well as a book? Is it enjoyable to read? Would you recommend it to colleagues and/or include it in a course syllabus? So that were the things that we looked at. And on this basis, as I said, we had several rounds of deliberations. First came up with a list of finalists, if you want, and then again, ultimately decided that Stephen B. Kaplan's book, Globalizing Patient Capital, The Political Economy of Chinese Finance in the Americas, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, that this book deserves to receive the Luciano Tomassini Latin American International Relations Book Award. So in the view of the committee, Stephen's book makes an excellent contribution on a subject that is extremely important for understanding the economy and international politics of Latin America. He's introducing a new concept, patient capital, and with this he studies the impact of Chinese finance in Latin America and explores it from both sides. On the one hand, the Chinese side, the creditor side, and on the other hand, the Latin American debtor perspective. And the committee was impressed by the quality of empirical research reflected in a multi-method data collection and analysis. Stephen draws on fieldwork and interviews with decision makers in China, Latin America, and the US, as well as quantitative analysis of an originally constructed data set. And he also has conducted a comparative case study analysis across 7 middle-income countries in the region, that were Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Jamaica, and Venezuela. From a Latin American perspective, the book sheds light on the most important extra-regional bilateral relationship of most countries in the region in the 21st century, namely China. However, the book is relevant not only for those who are interested in China's influence in Latin America, but also for those who study Latin America's relations with the United States and with the international institutions created and dominated by the US, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The book explains in a very convincing way why Latin America has alternatives beyond Washington. Kaplan's analysis is therefore not only key to the understanding of contemporary events in Latin America, but also crucial to imagine the future of the region's international relations. So furthermore, the committee has also determined to grant a honorable mention to a second book, the book American Mirror, the United States and Brazil in the Age of Emancipation by Roberto Saba. Let me just check whether he's here today. No, I don't think so. Anyway, this book is a completely different book. It investigates how American and Brazilian reformers worked together to ensure that slave emancipation would advance the interests of capital. It is an exceptionally well-written and documented historiographical work on a subject that has received little attention in the field of Latin American international relations. In contrast to earlier work studying slavery in comparative perspective, Saba explores the transnational dimensions of the phenomenon, in particular between the United States and Brazil. And his book offers a new take on how the abolition of slavery was intertwined with the expansion of capitalism. Both books, while coming from different disciplines, different methodological approaches, different fields of study, in our view, made an important contribution to our understanding of hemispheric relations and Latin American international affairs. So that is why we decided to pick those books. And today our focus is going to be on Stephen's book, who is the winner of the award. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Stephen now to present his work to us. Thank you.
Sure, I'm in view here. There we go. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be recognized by the profession, and I'm very excited to share my work with all of you today. So let me just share my slides here. That's right. Okay. I have a tendency to want to be mobile, but I have to remember that, yes, I have to stay in sight for the camera online, so I shall do that. Excellent. So if we start by looking at this first graph here, it looks at China and China's international banking activity. And as you can see, particularly since the global financial crisis, there's been a huge increase in China's international banking flows. In this chart, you can see other classic kind of traditional international bankers from Germany to Japan, the United States to the United Kingdom. In 2008, those countries started to withdraw their presence and their financing internationally. This provided an opportunity for China to move in and expand its international financing flows. They had been in other regions of the world, including Africa, but really took this opportunity to increase their footprint internationally. As you can see in this graph, over the course of a very short time, about 15 years, they became a top 5 banking creditor internationally. So of course, then the key question is, well, as China becomes a global international banker, are they any different than traditional bankers? And what are the implications then for Latin American governments and Latin American policymaking? I'm trying to, oh, there we go, okay. So first of all, another graph we can look at just to kind of get a feel for broader stylized facts about what China is doing internationally is that compared to traditional financing, which tended to be the majority of it from private entities and institutions, we see that China basically makes its mark as an official creditor, and even surpassing traditional official creditors from the West, including the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, as you can see in this graph. China Exim Bank, as well as China Development Bank, Their key sort of policy banks, have a huge increase in their activity internationally, and particularly in Latin America as well. Should note in looking at the graph, the China Exim Bank not only includes loans, but that also includes trade financing. But even if you remove trade financing, China Exim Bank's activity as well as China Development Bank activity is still higher than World Bank and American Development Bank combined, particularly as we moved into the mid 2010 years. So in terms of theoretical framework, right? Basically, the question that I started with, right, that I had in my mind was so much of the literature we read about in terms of mobile capital, the mobile capital tends to be private capital, right? And because it was private capital, over the course of several decades, there was the expectation that private capital would constrain what policymakers were able to do, constrain their policy maneuverability. Basically, one of the key models from a political economy perspective was the Mundell-Fleming trilemma. That suggests, right, that there's a trade-off between your economic policy autonomy and exchange rate stability, right? And the key element of this Mundell-Fleming trilemma is that capital would be private, right? And also prone to exit given its short-term focus. This could create financial instability and currency depreciation that would erode profits, right? So in reaction to this potential capital exit threat, then governments often would be compelled to raise interest rates or constrain their fiscal expenditures to re-attract investment. So the key question would be, well, what happens when this mobile capital is no longer, right, private, but rather official and state-led and massive in scale? Does this change this kind of trilemma, this budget constraint that capital exit threat creates, right, for governments? And so essentially, if we think of China's overseas investment, we should think not only comparatively in terms of private versus state-led, but also restrictions, right, on capital outflows. So where we in the United States often think of our 401ks, right, and the ability to invest internationally in these 401ks and equities and bond markets, et cetera, there are limits in China on individual investment in financial assets overseas. So there's minimal short-run financial connections between China and the rest of the world. So as a result, right, a lot of the overseas investment that is flowing from China initially, right, tended to be very much state-led and infrastructure financing. By the end of the presentation, we'll take a moment and try to look at, okay, how is China's overseas financing changing in the present environment, post-COVID, et cetera, because it has been changing. But we'll sort of first look at sort of how they entered a lot of these markets and how they were able to increase their financial and economic influence internationally. So some key elements too, in terms of what is patient capital, right? How do we define patient capital? The first one is a long maturity structure, right? Not only is China's scale really large, as we just saw, but compared to private creditors, right, which tend to have maturities of maybe 5 years for their various loans, average maturity for Chinese loans is about 17 years. And this reflects that infrastructure-oriented nature of global financing. We also see that as China emerges on the scene, there's high risk tolerance, right, by design. The China Development Bank in its early years, board of directors were a lot of Westerners, right, advising from, chairman of AIG, right, to Kissinger, right, advising China Development Bank on what to do. And the idea was, oh, well, China has this massive banking system, right, one of the largest banking systems in the world. If they use this banking system to provide cheap subsidies to their companies internationally, they can compete with commercial banks and actually take on a lot more risk as well. So the idea was, as China was trying to internationalize its firms, wow, if you can have this cheap infrastructure financing that was not only oriented towards the project per se, but catalyzing greater economic activity, oh, well, Chinese firms could gain access to cheap assets, market share, improve key logistical skills such as marketing and distribution, local engineering capacity, right? This is all part of the broader internationalization of Chinese firms. And compared to what we see with Western financing, which oftentimes, right, there's a conversation about bankable projects, right? Is your project profitable, yes or no? Comparatively, with Chinese financing, there's often the term used of strategic credit spaces, right? Create activity and more risky environments, right? So in other words, in doing interviews, right, and in the course of this project, had about 250 total field research interviews across 7 countries in Latin America, but also additionally within China, spent a lot of time in China talking with bankers there as well. And effectively, I would ask, well, okay, well, what happens if this project, this infrastructure project, that there's a lot of criticism, what happens if you undergo a loss there? What do you do? And one of the common answers was, well, it's not about the one infrastructure project, right? It's about creating sort of trade, creating economic activity, right? And maybe if a firm loses out in that first infrastructure project, they'll benefit down the road from other economic opportunities. So it's much more of a strategy of a web and expanding the web of Chinese commercial ties over time. Now, of course, notwithstanding, right, higher risk tolerance, it's not limitless, right? As we've seen in Venezuela, Pakistan, and other countries internationally, where when sort of economies or governments get into trouble, China tends to, move to the sidelines, right? As they did in Venezuela, issue a moratorium, on the debt so that countries can kind of take their time to repay China. But oftentimes we may not see sort of the issuance of new loans during these point in times. So of course, it's not limitless risk tolerance, but of course, even in Venezuela, that prudence came after, a decade or more of lending. So here we can see an example of how China's patient capital works relative to Western capital, relative to private capital, which typically during a downturn tends to exit, right? Oftentimes, once there's economic volatility, once there's concern about economic, political confidence, money tends to be very short-term focused and tends to withdraw very quickly. However, you can see as China's moving into these markets and trying to expand their financial and commercial footprint, the opposite's happening. Every time there's a downturn, China comes in, right? Creates sort of an infrastructuring financing opportunity, buys cheap assets, right? This graph in particular shows FDI into Brazil, and China's coming in every time there's a crisis and continuing to buy, right? So viewing oftentimes volatility as an opportunity, right? And then finally, we have conditionality, which is a really important element of patient capital. And compared to, right, oftentimes early on in particular, many countries would consider, oh, well, China doesn't have conditionality, right? No conditionality. And then compared to West, policy conditionality, there's often very stringent, often very polemic for countries as well, right? There was this sort of marketing of Chinese finance comparatively as being, oh, well, no strings attached, right? Cheap financing. Countries have huge infrastructure deficits, right? Coming out of their austerity periods of the 1990s, China's willing to help build infrastructure, right? And extend new infrastructure financing without the conditionality of the West, right? So this seems, right, from a soft power perspective, very appealing to many countries early on. And China, of course, had their official doctrine of non-intervention in domestic affairs based upon their 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And essentially this non-intervention, right, as I was mentioning before, even though compared to policy conditionality where, multilateral institutions and Western economic officials are attaching new lending to conditions, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no conditions with Chinese financing, right? And in fact, there's what I call in the book commercial conditionality, right? If we come back to sort of the anecdote I was talking about before about policy banks, right? Saying, oh, well, it's really about maximizing markets, right? It's not about necessarily the bankability of one project, but rather expanding the market share in key strategic sectors, right, of Chinese firms. So from this perspective, there's a whole lot of commercial conditionality that's tied into the lending, right? So for example, oftentimes when talking about this issue with ministers from around the region, they talk about the fine print, right? That fine print might be guaranteed contracts with Chinese firms, contractors or suppliers, commitments to buy Chinese machinery, right? Oftentimes too, in order to hedge this lending, right? If you don't have policy conditionality, then the question is, how do you hedge this lending? Well, similar to its domestic model, China would use commodities, natural resources in order to securitize the financing. So we see structures of lending that be oriented towards, well, okay, we're interested in building this infrastructure financing. We want to actually ensure that we're repaid. We have a policy non-intervention. We're not engaging in policy and conditionality, but instead, right, we'll have separate commercial contracts from state-owned enterprises, right, oil and other types of contracts, where exporters send their oil to China, right, and the proceeds from those oil sales are deposited in bank accounts that explicitly are oriented towards repaying China and nobody else, right? So it gives China preferential status as well. So not only are you mitigating your risk, right? One of the big issues whenever there's sort of a debt crisis is who gets paid first. China having these accounts that are oriented towards just repaying China for these loans allows them to be first in line. So you can kind of see there's a whole range of commercial conditionality, which we'll unpack in a few moments, that China has within its deals, ranging from commercial conditions to also, right, using commodities and loans and natural resources to securitize the contracts. So all in all, right, we see a variety of tools for promoting Chinese commerce: bilateral tied aid, China foreign content, commercial interest rates, and currency promotion, right? So a lot of the kind of ways that other countries operate internationally, we see this with China's commerce as well, right? Trying to maximize its own foreign content within these financing deals. So in some ways, I like to think of these financing deals actually as much more like trade deals, right? Because even though, right, again, from a soft power, from an opportunity perspective, it's often marketed as cheap infrastructure financing, helping overcome infrastructure deficits of countries. At the same time, right, it's oriented to really maximizing China's commercial imprint. So for countries from Latin America, it's really important, this capacity question, right? Making sure that they negotiate for local opportunities for firms, right? A good example of this would be during the Macri administration, right? The cargo railway project in Argentina, pretty much 100% of that was Chinese content, right? So you have the cheap infrastructure financing to build this railway, but China's maximizing their foreign content. So we have a Macri administration coming in and saying, well, let's try to negotiate more local content for Argentina. One thing, right, that they were able to successfully do is Argentina has an industry for local railroad ties, right? During the first agreement, right, there wasn't much commercial opportunity for those local companies, but we see over time Argentina learning and starting to negotiate their own content in these deals, right, and not necessarily being lured in solely by cheap infrastructure financing. This has happened even in the last year, right, as Argentina has struggled once again financially. They've tried to find ways to make, sort of their financial conditions improved. We have similarly a negotiation for a nuclear power plant in Argentina, and China was providing 85% of the financing, and in exchange, China would get, right, commercial opportunities, ensure that in fact Argentina would use China's technology in exchange for this cheap financing. But Argentina then, this past year, has been negotiating for 100% for China to finance 100% of that contract rather than 85%, which has held up the deal, but also kind of shows that Argentina is getting more savvy in terms of the way it's trying to negotiate these contracts. So commercial conditionality and negotiating for local content is a really key element of these deals. And also, as mentioned before, it's really important to think about sort of Chinese financing as not just cheap infrastructure financing, but rather it's tools for managing their sovereign risk. And this ranges from administrative tools to commodity guarantees, as we talked about before, cross-default clauses. So in other words, again, in Argentina, when China ran into trouble, right, Macri administration comes in, there's big infrastructure financing projects in the south, right? And essentially, there's a lot of concern about the environmental sustainability of these projects. So, right, there ends up being a legal stay to hold up, right, any new development in these contracts so that they're more environmentally stable. What does, or environmentally sustainable, what does the Macri administration then do? Basically, as it holds up these projects, it starts getting letters from China, right, administratively, reminding them of cross-default clauses in these contracts. In other words, right, if Argentina decides not to move forward with the hydroelectric projects in the south, they will nullify all other contracts in the country, including cargo railway, right? So you see there's different tools for mitigating risk. Cross-default clauses are usually involved in lots of different debt contracts internationally. It's not exclusive to China, but right, the way they'll tend to implement it administratively is a bit different. Also, sort of a key feature here are those commodity-backed loans before, right? Again, if you have these accounts that are oriented towards taking proceeds from these oil exports internationally and using them as a way to basically undergird the deal, securitize the deal, well, that's a good way of mitigating risk, right? And so we see that China does that very frequently as well, particularly with places like Ecuador and Venezuela, where the loans were oriented towards, sort of commodity sectors, things along these lines. Here's an example of the cross-default clause right here. This comes from Argentina, and it shows sort of the language that's typical in a Chinese contract. What's really important here, getting back to the point about room to maneuver, right? And countries having more room to maneuver with state-to-state financing, we could see as a share of GDP that China's policy bank loans actually start to rise as a share of GDP and become just as high as multilateral loans, particularly in an environment where initially bond financing had been declining. As China's policy bank loans account for more of a country's share of GDP, that means the lack of scrutiny about macro policy, the lack of scrutiny about policy conditions. This gives countries more degrees of maneuverability. A good example of this kind of pattern would be in Venezuela, where I've talked with people from the policy banks of China who had loans extended, had research departments that were making recommendations, right? Kind of traditional macroeconomic recommendations we might think about that other institutions like the IMF or World Bank might make, and yet they couldn't enforce it, right? And so they kind of would express frustration at the lack of being able to enforce this. I also suggest this is why this kind of lending isn't necessarily a debt trap, right? But rather sort of a creditor trap to some extent, where China's policy banks are learning as they go along, right? And in fact, oftentimes when they've lent to places like Venezuela, and they've had difficulty regaining these investments, there's much more, I've heard from sort of Chinese bankers, much more frustration as a result of this, right? Rather than any kind of purposeful intent to bankrupt countries or increase their debt. So I think this is a really important point to think about. But what ends up happening, right, as is exemplified by the example, is effectively China extends its financing, but there are no conditions. There's no strings attached. Many presidents, right, have talked about this, right, from Correa to Chavez to Maduro, talking about the fact that there are no strings attached with Chinese financing. This gives them more degrees of maneuverability. So getting back to our opening theoretical framework, where private capital had this exit threat that tend to constrain, right, the budgets of countries. Comparatively, we see with Chinese financing, it actually opens up, right, their policy space. Could be an opportunity, but could be an opportunity for development on one level, could also be an opportunity for greater discretion and greater opportunism for governments as well. Now, importantly, China has very diversified investment, right? They have state-to-state loans, as we've talked about, but they also have market-oriented loans. These market-oriented loans would be more oriented towards procurement projects, right? So government advertises procurement, there's open bids on these procurement, and then rather than be a state-to-state deal, the financing comes in on the level of the project and finances sort of winning bids of that project, right? I make an argument that this kind of market-oriented loan is much different from the state-to-state loans. Here's a good example. I'll walk through two examples within the Argentina case just to kind of further this analysis a bit more. The state-to-state channel, right, is exemplified by hydropower stations in Santa Cruz, Argentina. Here you have direct contracting, right? Even though Argentine law says you need to go out, right, and get bids if the government's going to contract, under Article 5 of Law 27 says if it's concessional, this is not necessary, right? So the nuclear power agreement I was referencing before, why is that attractive to Argentina? They get this cheap concessional lending, right? So even I've interviewed ministers within Argentina to say, oh, well, without this concessional lending, it might not be as interesting to us, right? So you have, as a result of this, also state indebtedness, right? Argentina has to provide a state guarantee for the loan. As mentioned before, you get a lot of Chinese local content attached to it, right? So 23% of the loan paid for Chinese machinery and equipment, 77% was oriented towards civil works projects, right? But they're spending discretion here, much more fungibility. And finally, transparency, right? Effectively in the environmental, in the hydroelectric plant, there was the environmental concerns I was talking about before. We have the Supreme Court ruling that suspends, right, the project out of environmental concerns. And ultimately, sort of, we get a renegotiation of the number of turbines and generating capacity, et cetera. But one of the problems is this happened very late in the process, right? Once the deal is done, then afterwards, environmental actors start agitating and saying, okay, well, this isn't sustainable. This isn't Perito Moreno. This is one of the national treasures of Argentina. This can be depleting water supply, et cetera there. Why are we going to move forward with this? But it's happening very late in the process, right? This results to some extent from the opacity of the deal, right? Where it's not very well known, the terms of the deal. It's not very transparent, right? So this is a key difference with the state-to-state channel. If we then shift over to private procurement, such as the solar park in Argentina, we have a privately managed auction system called Renovar. And we have Shanghai Electric Power Construction won the bid for a 390 million solar park. Here, right, as mentioned before, the loan is more market oriented. It flows directly to corporate enterprises with the winning bid, rather than through the Argentine government, leaving little room for spending discretion, right? And we have an actor, a development bank, China's Exim Bank, using loans, right, that are oriented towards maximizing, right, China's commercial footprint internationally. So that's still there. But comparatively, from a transparency perspective, we get sort of more local community consent. Local communities receive training to work in the plant, construction and operations. They could participate in the profits, right? So there's much more transparency comparatively when it's moving through this channel. Also, when it's moving through this channel, you don't have the discretion where the government gets these funds and has the ability to have a little more discretion surrounding these funds, right? It tends to go right towards the project level comparatively. So now what I want to do is share with you some of the sort of stylized facts and empirics from the book, now that we've kind of teased out what should be happening based upon the book's theory. Just to review, essentially the theory suggests is that as you shift from private capital that has a capital exit threat and will create a budget constraint on countries, China's state-to-state capital tends to allow countries to have more degrees of maneuverability, greater policy autonomy, able to spend more, right? Depending upon local governance, this could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, right? But then the trade-off is one of commercial conditionality, right? Where China says, okay, we have non-intervention, we're not going to come in with lots of policy conditionality, we're not going to tell you to balance your budget, we're not going to tell you to privatize, we're not going to give you sort of a list of reforms, but instead, they're much more microeconomic rather than macroeconomic, right? So a lot of what we get are these commercial conditions trying to maximize Chinese content, trying to securitize a deal with commodities and natural resources, trying to even, right, increase the internationalization through transactions of the renminbi as well. So now we want to look at some of these empirics that support these trends. First of all, we could see as China's bilateral credit in this graph grows as a share of total external financing, we see primary budget balances, right? When China represented only a 5% of total public external financing in your average country, we would see budgetary surpluses. But as China's financing increases as a share of total financing, right, as there's less scrutiny of budgets, et cetera, we see that blue, right, the deficit number increasing over time. We also see this in our regression results as well. When you have China's state-to-state financing as a share of debt, either normalized by debt or GDP, we get a negative number in terms of fiscal balance, right? meaning China's state-to-state finance is associated with higher fiscal deficits. Comparatively, if we look at traditional Western sources of financing, bonds and multilateral loans, we see a different story, right? We get a positive coefficient, meaning that bonds tend to be related with higher budget discipline, more narrow fiscal deficits. Not surprisingly, given there tends to be all this policy conditionality surrounding multilateral loans, but even bond markets that take their cues from often IMF reports, et cetera. We see multilateral loans also having that same effect, Western multilateral loans, where effectively it is associated with higher budget discipline, narrow fiscal deficits over time. So, we see very much that countries tend to have more degrees of maneuverability with Chinese financing. We can also see it in this graph over here as well. China's state-to-state loans, right? Particularly in Argentina, Ecuador, and Venezuela from 2000 to 2018. These are countries that during this period of time often had left of center governments, but they had budgetary surpluses, in part due to the commodity boom where they had more revenues, right? But also in part due to they were mostly reliant on Western financing and Western markets when they didn't have commodity proceeds. Comparatively, after the 2008 financial crisis, where China takes this opportunity to expand its lending internationally, and particularly in Latin America, the blue chart is China's increased banking activity within Latin America, particularly within Argentina, Ecuador, and Venezuela. You could see deficits start to grow, right? Budget deficits start to grow quite a bit. Not surprisingly, 2008 was an economic downturn. We would anticipate countries to spend during an economic downturn, but the difference is that spending doesn't stop, right? We see ongoing increase in budget deficits. And I would make the argument that in part, this is because China has provided with these countries with more room to maneuver. In some cases, and particularly in the cases you see here, China is accounting for as much in the cases of Ecuador and Venezuela as a third of their total external financing, right? So as that number gets higher and higher, that's going to give countries more degrees of policy flexibility. Now we want to look at the other side of the trade-off, right? So we've seen that China's financing could provide countries with more degrees of maneuverability compared to private capital. But we also have made the argument that commercial conditionality is a key feature of these loans. There's different kinds of commercial conditionality. As you see in this chart, the one represents kind of your traditional tied aid. That's contracts for machinery, contracting with Chinese firms, things along these lines. The two represents your commodity-backed loans, right? This is when sort of either you get oil for loan deals or loans securitized by resources or commodities. And what we see is in the gray, we have state-to-state lending, right? And in the black, we have much more of this market-oriented channel. What we see is we get much more of these commodity-backed loan deals and conditions when we get state-to-state loans. That's exemplifying sort of this is an attempt from China to hedge risk when they don't have policy conditionality or other tools to use. And comparatively, you can see, notwithstanding the kind of deal, we get a lot of Chinese content either way over time. Even in sort of these market-oriented deals are also characterized by high China commercial content. The difference being anytime it toggles state to state, we get a lot more sort of securitization, commodities, resources, oil for loan deals as well. We can also see it in this graph here as China's state-to-state financing expands, we get greater Chinese commercial conditions as well over time. So in terms of from the debtor Latin American perspective, the cost and benefits, right, of this financing opportunity, how it compares to traditional Western financing. Well, in a region, right, that throughout sort of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s became very frustrated with austerity, right, and had to deal with austerity by cutting infrastructure, right? In terms of looking at social spending or other initiatives over time during the austerity years, oftentimes we still saw increases in education and things along these lines, but we saw massive cuts in infrastructure, right? So effectively, if we think Latin American investment, right, go back to the 1980s, they had 3% rates, right, of investment. Comparatively, by the 2000s, it had dropped to 0.6% of GDP. So Latin America's way of dealing with all this austerity was a lot of infrastructure cuts. Enter China, right? And China offers cheap infrastructure financing in an area right, that Latin America desperately needs, in an area where, wow, there's lots of political visibility as well. So these are the potential benefits of Chinese financing, but of course the costs are its commercial conditionality, right? Loans tied to Chinese firms, products, and machinery, right? The key lesson is Latin Americans really need to think of this like a trade deal, negotiate much more for local content within Latin America. Because just like China struggles with the middle income trap, right, is trying to get beyond its own middle income trap, many countries in Latin America are struggling with the middle income trap, right? And the key has been to try to upgrade, right, the industrial sector. But even this Chinese financing that comes in outside of Brazil, right, we get sort of, lots of electronic buses, factories, lots of FDI oriented towards manufacturing within Brazil, but not necessarily elsewhere in the region, right? So industrial upgrading is definitely a key element of doing these deals with China, thinking about, okay, well, a lot of these deals, if they're actually increasing sort of China's exports internationally and China's exports in capital inputs, what does this do to our own industries domestically, right? So important questions to be asking. Finally, indebtedness, right? Certainly, China's not the only actor here, right? As I mentioned before, I don't think China engages in a debt trap as much as sort of they're a new global creditor that's been learning internationally and sort of, been made good investments, made bad investments, but has contributed to sort of concerns about indebtedness post-pandemic. We can look at some quick stylized facts for each of these patterns, and then we'll close up. Essentially, first, we can see high-tech manufacturing, right? High-tech manufacturing imports from China have increased dramatically since the global financial crisis, where look at sort of high-tech manufacturing imports from the United States has really plateaued over that same point in time, right? So it's important to kind of think about, again, the multiplier effects, right, of Chinese financing and sort of how it opens the door to a lot of other capital inputs from China coming into the region. We can also see in terms of Latin America's exposure to China and sort of commodity dependency, a longstanding issue for the region. We see since 2008, right, we just see, and particularly since China joined the WTO, we see sort of an increasing reliance on primary commodity exports to China. Comparatively, if you look at Latin American manufacturing good exports to China, that's fallen off since China's WTO entry and continued to decline since the global financial crisis. And finally, we'll end with debt and look at the Venezuelan example here. In the chart in the red, that is China's outstanding debt to Venezuela compared to its total debt of 200%. So you see, China is one of many creditors, an important creditor, but not the only creditor. So China's misallocated, right? Miscalculated risk, misallocated resources into projects that have gone bust in Venezuela, but so have many other creditors as well. The key difference is this is Venezuela's oil company, state-owned oil company, and its export barrels per day. Essentially, remember, this is the way that China securitizes its lending internationally. And what we could see happening in this chart is the red is China, the yellow is Russia, and the green is PetroCaribe. These are outstanding commitments, right? Pre-commitments of its oil internationally. And we could see as oil production declines in Venezuela, those pre-commitments are taking up more and more of the outstanding pie, meaning as oil production falls, China's attempt to securitize its lending via oil in Venezuela went horribly awry. So in closing, we can look at China's diversified strategy internationally today. Started with the 2014 commodity downturn, intensified with the pandemic. Similar to China's approach domestically, where there's lots of different instruments, it's incremental, it's diversified. This is what we see China doing internationally. So the headlines, the state-to-state deals get the headlines, but China also has sort of state-backed equity funds that are oriented to investing on the level of the company. They also have FDI as well. Increasingly, what we're seeing is a diversified structure of China's financing. For example, FDI over the course of the last several years has been $4 billion in the region, right? So FDI flows have actually started to replace sort of the amount of outstanding state-to-state, new outstanding state-to-state loans we see in the region. So this is very important. Also in key sectors like lithium, right? Essentially, most of the FDI going into Argentina today, right, is in the lithium sector, right? So this also is sort of really important in highlighting, right? China will use a lot of different tools, right? It's trying to maximize its market shares of its firms internationally. They entered using state-to-state lending, but once they get more of a commercial footprint, they start to use all these other tools, right? And FDI has been a key tool in order to secure lithium within the region. The state-backed equity funds, huge nominal amounts, as much as $40 billion have been dedicated to them. Importantly, only about $2 to $3 billion have been allocated in Latin America today. The total commitments currently that are at these funds are about 5%. So they have room to continue these equity investments. And certainly they've been doing that over time in areas such as manufacturing, logistics, agriculture, even technology, as we've seen in Argentina. We also see since 2019, much more of a move towards multilateralism, right? So AIB has a bigger footprint in the region. Even China working as a stakeholder, the World Bank is another way it's tended to invest more in the region. So much more of a diversified structure today. AIB, their balance sheet continues to grow over time. It even seems like China's giving more emphasis on institutions like the AIB on a multilateral level for investing internationally. So with that, I'll leave you sort of with the debt point, right, which is essentially that China had very little new loans, about several billion in new loans over the course of the last 3 years to Latin America. So it's trailed off, but they have a huge amount of debt outstanding, particularly to countries like Ecuador, Venezuela, and even Argentina. And so it's very important to think about sort of the Keynes's old saying here, right? Oh, your banker 1,000 pounds and you're at his mercy. Oh, and 1 million pounds and the position is reversed. China has these outstanding obligations, right? Even though they have a huge banking system and they have the flexibility, right, to be able to absorb some of this lending, I would say the soft power issue for China is really key, right? Because there's optics here in terms of, when investments go awry, it does not reflect kind of China's development posture very well. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions. But first, I will turn it over to Victoria.
Perfect. Thank you so very much, Stephen, for such a great explanation, or rather, I guess, sharing of the main findings of your book. And first of all, I have to say I am honored and it's a pleasure to be able to comment on Stephen's book. And I have to say, first of all, it is well deserved of the award. It's definitely a must read. And I guess I'll start with that in saying that one of the main contributions that I can see from globalizing patient capital is that it really, really contributes and adds onto the growing literature on China-Latin American relations. And something that is very key and very important in here, right, that Stephen does, is that it's not only about the theoretical framework that he creates, the theory that he presents about globalizing, patient capital, but it's also the richness in providing interviews, in providing data, and how using this mixed methods approach, he really provides a very nuanced story of not just Chinese financing in Latin America, but also, as Brigitte said very early in her introduction, right? It really talks about the changes that the current international financial landscape is experiencing and how China is playing the game, right? Or rather, how it is inserting itself into this system, and in which it is becoming a top creditor, it is becoming a top lender. To what extent it competes with the World Bank and the IMF, I think that there's still some room for debate, and I'll explain that as I go with my comments. I'll try to be very brief because I do want to give opportunities to Q&A and maybe for Stephen to expand or give some comments on my comments, I guess. The way I structure my comments is that they are built onto trying to perhaps ask Stephen, or if he could provide even more nuance or more commentary on how the findings from his book has shaped a lot of the things that are happening right now, and what his opinion is. Maybe that would give room for another winning book, right, to write about it. So in any case, like Stephen just said, and like Brigitte explained, and also for those of you who have read the book, right? This is about how China is entering into Latin America in the finance area, and in comparison to Western lenders, right? It distinguishes itself by providing a longer term horizon, right? As he said, it has a longer maturity. It also is more risk tolerant in comparison, right? Which also gives a lot of space for Latin American countries to maneuver. So that's where we're starting. And something that really caught my attention, not only as Stephen was talking about right now, but also when I was reading the book and when I wrote the review for the book some time ago, is that it brings up the question not just about why Latin American countries have alternatives, but rather how many alternatives are there for the region in terms of lenders, right? And as we can see, for many of Latin American countries that are lower income, that have a, if you will, less, right, trustworthy, I guess, rating, borrowing becomes really, really, really difficult. So China comes as an alternative. So one of my questions is, right, what can not only Western lenders, I would say, learn about China, but rather what kind of alternatives are being provided to the region? What kind of alternatives are there for the region in such a way that China is not just the only alternative in many cases, but one of the many alternatives in such a way that countries do not see themselves in positions where it becomes even riskier, or in which they take deals that become riskier. And I say that because, as Stephen fantastically explained, one of the main characteristics of Chinese patient capital, right, is that there is not necessarily policy conditionality, but there is this commercial conditionality. And because there is this commercial conditionality, right, to what extent it also can exacerbate, I guess, the commodity dependency in some of these countries, and not only that, the industrial stagnation, because then you see this cycle, right, that countries cannot get out from. And as we can see in the case of Ecuador and Venezuela, right, they're really in trouble. They had to restructure the debt. There is no escape. And that also brings another question that I was thinking about, that Stephen put forth in saying that while the patient capital gives space for countries to maneuver, right? It gives them more space to work with the budget and what have you. But the assumption is also that many of these countries are supposedly going to use this extra space, right, to create projects for public service, social welfare. So the question is, to what extent is that true? And in which cases is that really applicable? Because at the end of the day, we're not only talking about the interest, right, of the Chinese banks in expanding their influence, in creating more market space. We're also asking the questions, why are Latin American countries, or rather, why are some administrations, right, choosing to take in the Chinese financing? For what purposes? For what projects? And are those, is that money, is that capital, is that loan really intended to be used for the purposes that it was initially given? And I say that simply because it is, as I would say, it's not always transparent, and also there are political interests at hand. And I would be curious to ask Stephen, right, what he thinks about, especially right now with the changes of governments in Latin America, with elections coming up, how he sees the environment and the conditions changing, right? Is China going to continue, or are Chinese policy banks continuing to be, let's say, the alternative that is posing there? What should Western lenders do, or not just Western lenders, any lenders in general, right? What alternatives, again, it always goes back to the question, what alternatives we are giving to the region? And not only that, as we talk about how politics, not necessarily from the China side, but more on the domestic side, right? Politicians, political interests, you want to be reelected. The reason why you're taking this kind of financing is in many ways, right? To create the kind of support that you want, not only for the provision of services. And I'm being very, I guess this is very hypothesis or hypothesizing, and I'm putting myself in the worst case scenario, but I think it's worth asking simply because of the kind of stability that the region is used to, or that unfortunately the region has experienced. So to what extent can we, or I'm curious rather to ask Stephen, to what extent has this so-called Chinese patient capital really worsened, right, the weakening of financial institutions in the region and financial structures, and has rather created this kind of unhealthy cycle, right? That no matter what, like we are seeing right now in the case of Argentina, no matter what, that there will always be some kind of restructuring, rollover in try to save not only Chinese owned loans, but also the countries themselves. I don't know if that makes a little bit of sense, but you can tell me to elaborate on this, because I was actually curious how I would put this into conversation with a more recent article that, for instance, I think is Horn and Reinhardt, who have recently written and has said, right, that Chinese financing has actually become emergency financing, because we are seeing this movement from lending to countries for development projects, for infrastructure projects. And right now, I think that they did an analysis in the last 10 or so years in which now we see not only Chinese giving development financing, but Chinese policy, not policy banks, Chinese banks giving also bailout money to save, right, the Chinese financing that unfortunately where the conditions were not met, or that restructure was needed. So we are seeing countries being trapped by the decisions that they made, not just necessarily Latin America, but also China itself. Because at the end of the day, right, and I love that Stephen highlighted this, is not necessarily a debt trap. On the one hand, we have a creditor trap, right, on the side of the Chinese. But at the same time, we also have, and I love what he puts in the book when he says that it's really becoming not only from patient capital, but rather a patient debt structure, restructuring, right, process. So I'm curious to hear about, more than anything else, about how Stephen sees the situation, how it has changed, right, from when he wrote the book, when he published the book, and what we're seeing right now, that we are seeing this movement that development financing is reducing in the case of the Chinese policy banks. And rather what we are seeing is that China is fairly, I wouldn't say desperate, but it's really stepping up into bailing out, right, saving those policy banks that initially signed these contracts 10 or 5 years or so, because the countries that they thought, even with the collaterals, even with the commercial conditionalities, right, that perhaps they could have some kind of returns, they are not seeing that. So they need to bail that out. So what does that say about the current international finance system? And not only that, what risk can we see given, as you have mentioned, the lack of opacity, the lack of transparency, right, and the uncertainty given the current economic crisis, debt crisis that the world is experiencing in general. But overall, I think that what I can say is that it is a great book. It gives you a lot of background on how China has started and begun, right, becoming this important creditor player in the region. But it also gives a lot of explanations and nuance on why some of these countries right now in the region, and perhaps even in the rest, the developing world, right, are in the position that they are, because while it might seem that it is a good deal, and in many cases it is perhaps the only deal, right, or the only option that these countries have, at the end of the day, what kind of trade-offs countries are willing to take, not only Latin American countries, but China itself. And I think that there is still a lot to be done and to explore this a little bit more. There are a lot of questions that I have, but I don't want to take time. I hopefully we'll give space for Q&A, and thank you so much.
Sure, I might, oh, the intercom's on, right? I might quickly respond to Victoria, but I'll keep it brief, and so then we can open up for questions from the audience as well. Also wanted to let you know that Victoria wrote a really nice review of the book on perspective of politics, really thoughtful and nuanced. So if you liked what you heard from her today, check that out as well. And you also sort of set up really well my next project, right, which I'm currently working on, which it looks at sort of debt restructuring. Right? And in the conclusion of the book, I'm talking a lot about, what are the implications, right, of this outstanding financing? Well, really important to think about development, right, is that we have lots of efforts internationally and multilaterally to deal with debt restructuring, right, such as the Common Framework, right, or DSSR.
Excuse me?
China Development Bank, which has the majority, 90%.
Dr. Stefan? Excuse me. Yeah, we are not hearing you in virtuality. Sorry, because of the mic. So sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
I just want to let you know.
Oh, I see the mic changed. Okay, got it.
Yes. So we can hear you here in virtuality. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Thank you. Better to interrupt now than not be mic'd up for, yes.
Okay, we hear you now.
Getting back to the earlier point, what I was saying was that one of the key implications of the book is that, the lesson in a lot of ways of Western financing in the region of the 1980s was that, wow, if there aren't kind of some kinds of conditions associated with these loans, there's the possibility of not being paid back. Now, these are very complicated issues. The region was struggling economically, we're struggling with outstanding debt, but from a creditor perspective, there was a notion of, well, how do we protect our investments? Conditionality grew out of that, right? Conditionality is imperfect. Policy conditionality, right, is not something that a lot of countries like. And as a result, non-conditionality, right, or China's form of lending was very appealing to many countries. But the problem is even trying to then guarantee all these investments with commodities, right, didn't work well, right, for China either. So I think there's an outstanding question of, right, how should debt be managed moving forward? And in fact, that sets up the next project where I'm looking at sort of outstanding debt within Latin America from China, how it compares to kind of Western debt historically. And what we see, the point I was making earlier about China Development Bank having the majority, 90% of the exposure to the region, is that they do not qualify as a public institution from China's perspective in all these multilateral debt initiatives, meaning they have bilateral discretion to work out all these loans with countries, right? So as a result, we're seeing China have a preference to work it out bilaterally. Why? The same points I was making earlier about market maximization, commercial conditionality, right? If they can kind of keep all the terms and negotiations bilateral, it gives them a lot more influence in terms of how the debt's worked out, and in terms of sort of even the commercial space for their companies in the long run as well. So indeed, I think this patient capital has turned into sort of a patient restructuring. One other keynote that I would make as well in response to Victoria's comments, and then we'll open it up for questions. And she was sort of raising the question of, well, what do alternatives look like? And what's happening today? I think, what's clear as we've all kind of moved around from conference to conference, seminar to seminar during these last few days, is the amount of political and economic volatility in the region is extremely high. I think China, like other actors, is trying to figure out how to mitigate all that volatility. One thing I think we're seeing, the trend away from state to state, right, is continuing, and they're using equity or FDI, where you're investing directly into the corporation at lower volumes, right? So you don't have this extraordinary level of risk that you did previously. That also works with the discretion, right? Because these state-to-state loans often had a lot of discretion with them. But if you're investing in the level of company, it helps to mitigate that risk over time. So certainly we're seeing China use these more diversified tools, not only for economic reasons, but also for political reasons as well, which I think is really key. So with that, I'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Hi, Cynthia Sanborn from the Universidad del Pacifico in Peru. I just want to join the praise for Stephen's book, which I've read several times, and I really believe it certainly merits this prize. And I think the virtues of this book are many, as Vicky pointed out. It's multidisciplinary. It means those of us who aren't economists or who aren't political scientists or who do both, it's really a political economy book and a great model as such. It's accessible and beautifully written, so it's not some stuffy academic book you have to wade your way through, and yet it's very rigorous in its methods and in its rich amount of information and detail and interviews, as Stephen mentioned. I think it's just a real model for graduate students and the rest of us who are struggling to define new projects. I had a comment and maybe a question. The first one was about, since you're trying to make an argument that's Latin American wide, and the cases you're looking at are not all of the region, although it's a lot of it, what you think about both learning and agency of those countries that have been more cautious or more responsible in their relationship with China. I follow Peru and Chile. I'm now following Colombia, as well as Colombia slips down that slope with more relations with China. And, I tend to focus on the side of the policymakers in those countries to be cautious about not incurring debt, but a whole lot more FDI and racing in traditional sectors and in new sectors, in energy and technology and in infrastructure and public works. And sort of, how do you see that? Do you see it more, is it more agency of our countries, or is it more China saying, I want to get into these countries that are more responsible and not so risky? And I guess the other question I have is about, updating. Do you see the Chinese really learning or avoiding risk in Venezuela and Ecuador again now? Or, Venezuela's not, Maduro's not going anywhere, and Venezuela still got oil, and Ecuador signed a free trade agreement with China. Or are they going to slip back in again in terms of this kind of lending to Venezuela and Ecuador? Or is that in your new book or your new project about restructuring what they've done in there?
Thank you very much for those questions. Is it okay if I answer those questions directly? Yep. Okay. I think we're pretty good on time, so I'll do it that way. Yeah. So in terms of the first question, right, how much is this driven by China and how much is it driven by local conditions? I make the argument in the book, and I extend it here as well, that's very much driven by local conditions, right? I think some of that diversified posture of China's development banks and financing it varies based upon what it encounters, right? So I think comparatively, as you know, in many countries, Peru, Colombia, Chile, it was much more of a trade, right, and FDI relationship rather than these state-to-state loans. What I would say is that they have a toolkit. And just like that was occurring simultaneously to all the state-to-state investment previously, now I think, oh yeah, China's trying to diversify the risk, but it doesn't mean that they won't use state-to-state loans anymore. So a good example of that would be if it's strategically important to China, right? Nuclear sector, as I was talking about before. Argentina has a huge nuclear presence in the region. China is trying to increase its footprint in nuclear power, right? If it can give concessional financing to Argentina, right? And they will use Chinese technology instead of Canadian, right? Or US technology as they did in the past, that is a commercial opportunity for China. And that's the point too of patient capital, using your banking system as a subsidy to undergird all this commercial activity internationally, right? Now, I think what's happening too is that at the same time, right, even though that's still in the toolkit, China sees a lot more economic and political risk, I think, in the region and internationally. Talking with bankers, for example, even the dollar alone, right? At the time I was last in China, there was concern about kind of US-China trade tensions and things along these lines, 2019 into 2020. And already, right, flows, it started to stop a bit because they were concerned about exchange rate risk and things along these lines, right? So I think what's happened now is they're using FDI, swap funds, all these other things in order to increase their presence in the region increase their presence in the region today. Which now is interesting because trade's at an all-time high, FDI is at an all-time high, even though these loans have started to trend off. So I think we have to be careful in the way we analyze this, and that state-to-state loans are still out there, but now they're kind of using much more of this diversified structure. Another area, just to kind of highlight where these kind of state-to-state loans are still happening, or loans from these policy banks, is in telecommunications, right? Many of you probably followed sort of the negotiations between the United States and Brazil as Huawei was going to build sort of 5G telecommunications infrastructure in Brazil. The United States tried to discourage Brazil from doing that, even using lump sum transfers in order to convince them to do that, right? Brazil didn't. Why? Patient capital. What happened in Brazil? When Brazil was constructing 2G, China used, right, 2 decades ago, cheap concessional financing, right, or cheap financing, not concessional, in order to expand China's footprint in the telecommunications sector, expand Huawei's footprint. Fast forward 2 decades, where the US is then trying to influence Brazil not to move ahead with telecommunications 5G contracts with Huawei, but Huawei already has, right, 65% of the market. So why would Brazil necessarily walk away, particularly when the United States doesn't have an alternative? In Mexico, there's an alternative through AT&T, right? There's AT&T sort of lab, but they haven't replicated that. The United States hasn't replicated that throughout the region, right? So I think that those are kind of very important things to kind of think about. The other part of your question I had in my head, remind me too, was
Venezuela and Ecuador now.
Oh, sure.
Maduro is
Yes.
his heels, and Korea's group is probably coming back.
Yeah, so I think that their posture has been, compared to private capital again, which might tend to leave altogether, their posture has been sidelines, right? Moratoriums, but not necessarily complete exit from these countries. So I think that sort of what's really important about it is that, again, that's why I call it patient restructuring too. They're waiting for commercial activity down the road. So the argument in the new book is that when it's strategically important to China, they're going to prefer to have greater bilateral discretion in debt renegotiations, right? So in a place like Ecuador, where we had almost 4 years of outstanding oil commitments and promises to China and a massive amount of debt, we see a willingness to restructure, or renegotiate, reschedule the terms of that debt, because I think there's also a desire to want to maintain a commercial presence over the long run, right? But they're quite comfortable when they think there's political volatility or political uncertainty to kind of step on the sidelines without necessarily exiting completely, hence the moratorium in Venezuela's case as well.
Let me echo this tremendous praise. I mean, so richly deserved this award. It's just wonderful. And I've seen it sort of from the beginning, being at GW, Cynthia McClintock from GW, and it's just fantastic to see how you've been able to, address such an important topic, perhaps the most crucial topic in, international relations with Latin America, democratization, political economy, and bring this tremendous wealth of data, information, mastery of the conceptualization of theory is just a tour de force. And as Cynthia Sanborn said, too beautifully written. If you haven't taken a look at it, Stephen is a great writer. It's very, very engaging. So like the others, my question is kind of a follow-up about, China, in the region today. In your next book, China makes the decision to loan more to Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, because they're perceived as kind of left governments at the time, and advancing soft power in those countries. At the same time, as Cynthia said, also makes the decision, okay, we'll do more investment to the Peru and Colombia. Well, now we see Colombia and Peru with more leftist governments, and of course, with that, more desires for transparency, more protection for communities, more environmental regulation. How is China perceiving this? I mean, how does China sort of balance, okay, we want the copper with maybe this is a greater opportunity for soft power?
Thank you for the book. I think everybody has the same opinion. It's enormous work behind it, and it's very informative. Thank you. And it stimulated me many other questions. First, China's patient capital is also adaptable. The adaptability of China is enormous, what you are telling us about. But borrowing this kind of lack of conditionalities was enormous temptations for the countries to borrow money, and they don't know how to pay it. and also to following the ideal of modernity is to invest this money in transportation and infrastructure. Bolivia bought a satellite with Chinese money called Tupac Katari, costed enormous money and is administered by China's people. The debt is to China. Bolivia is almost in bankruptcy now. Yeah, this temptation was enormous. Everybody was thinking, oh, borrowing without conditionality. That's what we need after the experience with the crisis from the 80s. But now also have the other part. Infrastructure doesn't pay off very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll answer those two, and then I see there's another question in the back, so we'll toggle there in a moment. But first, in terms of the last one, right? The point being, oh, well, all this borrowing without strings attached, right? This could be quite problematic. Isn't this a lesson that the region, I think if I understand you correctly, should have learned, right? Or should have been aware of? Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I think to some extent there has been, and we'll talk first of all, so there's two learning questions, first from the Latin American side, and then to Cynthia's question from the creditor side. But from the Latin American side, I think there has been learning, and probably more directly from debt markets. I have another paper that I'm working on with natural resources and debt markets. And the puzzling thing there is creditors are quite willing in debt markets to give cheap financing to Latin American countries during commodity booms. The Latin American countries, right, tend over the course of the last 20, 25 years, not to necessarily borrow, right? Which is surprising, right? But I think there has been some learning from that perspective in debt markets, that debt markets have huge costs. I think early on when debt markets were first formulated with the Brady restructuring, it was viewed as this cheap financing opportunity, right? And the region ran and grabbed that opportunity. But then there are lessons in terms of the cost. And I think we see more prudence in terms of actually issuing bonds today, right? Even when they're offered cheaply by financial markets. I think what's happened to China is the same way that China said, well, you know what? We don't have to use the Western model. We don't have to use policy conditionality. I've interviewed policy bankers who said, we have a different model, right? We're going to use commodities. We're going to, you can dig up the oil from the ground. That can be the collateral. And I think in a similar way, right, as I was talking about China learning as a creditor, right, in terms of, oh, wow, well, if you don't have sufficient oil production in Venezuela, that debt's not going to get repaid, right? So it doesn't matter how you try to securitize it. Comparatively, I think for the region, this cheap infrastructure financing type of loans, there's also been some lessons learned from the region. I talked about previously viewing like a trade deal, ensuring that the region gets higher local content. I think in a similar way, we've seen countries like Ecuador where when they couldn't issue debt elsewhere globally, I think this was another one of Victoria's questions, right? Where China's willing to finance when no one else will. Well, it wasn't necessarily development financing because some of these interest rates in Ecuador were quite high, right? Ministers have even resigned over how high the interest rates were, even when Ecuador's credit started to improve, right? So where Venezuela, we see that cheap subsidy used to enter their oil markets, comparatively, right, when Ecuador was in more dire straits, those interest rates tended to rise a bit too, right? So there's certainly lessons learned in terms of that financing isn't as cheap as you think. And even that we've seen that in Ecuador with Lasso, right? Where there's been sort of this pivot to negotiating with China, taking a harder stance with China, getting China to agree to $1 billion worth of restructuring of loans. So certainly, I think has been some lessons learned from the Latin American side. Cynthia then was sort of asking a question about sort of transparency, right? Part of what I looked at earlier on a project level was a difference in sort of the financial flow, right? And whether it goes state to state or via project and the implication of that. And the question on some level was, well, is China learning? Are they going to be a different actor? I think my answer for that would be, I think they're behaving different bilaterally than they are multilaterally. So in other words, the AIIB, right? We're seeing China use that multilateral bank, has very similar governance structure to the World Bank, and it's all oriented towards procurement projects, right? So we're seeing with AIIB much more sort of that type of Western governance structure that we're accustomed to. I think we are seeing some learning formally within the region, right, where we're seeing more use of green credits and different things, in terms of, the kind of contracts that are entered into. But I still think that's a very slow process, right? As I think as Monica de Hoyt, right, has written about extensively with Costa Rica, right, that sometimes sort of that process where Costa Rica relatively there's more transparency, right? But then you read the commercial reports from the Chinese side, and the view of that transparency is, wow, it really slows down the project. All this negotiation, all these feasibility studies, it slows everything down. And then that can be sort of, I think, a frustrating process from a commercial standpoint for China, right? So certainly, I think, they have the structure to orient themselves more towards procurement, orient themselves more towards transparency, et cetera, but it's not happening overnight. But I think it's happening very slowly. One way that is exemplified is the World Bank IMF meetings. When we now see sort of Chinese bankers come to those meetings, they talk about the importance of labor, environmental issues, and things along these lines in a way they didn't previously. But of course, I still think the progress is a lot slower bilaterally than it is multilaterally, in part because we have new multilateral institutions that are more nimble and more able to kind of adjust. And there was a question, I think, in the back there in the green, right? Oh, great, terrific. Yeah, go for it.
Should I check the
Right
online
here, yeah.
question first? Yes, okay. Okay, so there's an online question from Diego Abente Brun, who says, I'd like to echo the congratulations to Stephen for his very sophisticated and groundbreaking book. Would you like to comment on how you do expect the United States to deal with this? And yes, and second question. Sorry, I'm gonna scroll down
While
here.
you're scrolling down, we have also a question in the back over there, if you want to add yours too. Oh, sure. Thank you.
Well, I also am in agreement with the congratulations you received. Perhaps my comment comes from my interest in the more like theoretical implications of what you've said more broadly, and hopefully can contribute to thinking about the second book and expanding a bit the argument. So one thing that I was thinking about while reading the book is to what extent this way in which China is lending money today is a new thing. This patient capital is a new strategy, something completely off China nowadays, or it's something that historically has happened in Latin America. The way you just told the story is like little conditionality until the debt crisis, then the type of Western conditionality we have now, and now we have this new approach that China is taking towards this, right? But I just finished reading this great book by a scholar at Yale called Didek Kaplan. He's a more historical economic, and this book is called Pawn States, recently printed by Princeton University Press and prize-winning book as well. And basically his argument is that in the 19th century, the Europeans lent to Latin America in a way that very similar to you, he calls extreme conditionality. And essentially it looked like, okay, I'll give you this money, but you will have to invest on my train, for example, companies. And the train company would be part of the collateral if you don't pay this debt. And also they have something very similar to what you call a commercial conditionality. Sometimes the French would have an office in the customs of Lima that would cash the money to pay back their own debt, right? And so that makes me think that maybe what China is doing now, you could frame in a broader context of how the West actually learn on how to lend and why, even if they did that in the risky environments of the 1880s, right? Why they wouldn't do it now, right? And there, from that sort of broader historical perspective on finance in foreign powers in Latin America, several questions come to mind. But the most important, I would say, is how do you think about enforcement, right? Because at the time, if we didn't pay in time from Argentina, the British and the French would send both, would blockade our ports for 2 years until we paid, right? But China certainly cannot do this, and I think the West lends the way they do, and the type of conditionality that we are accustomed to exists, because that's the kind of conditionality that you can enforce multilaterally if you are part of the system. So if in the context of a China that is being increasingly pushed away of the global financial system and institutions, right? And how do you see China will deal in these bilateral deals with increased, with enforcement of these conditionalities, etc.
All right, and just to add the second question from Diego Abente-Brun, which referred to BRICS, the re-emergence of BRICS and the BRICS Bank, now under the new Brazilian government. How do you think China will approach this? And you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I'll make it relatively quick. So in terms of the question here, and then I'll proceed to Diego's questions next. I have read Pawn States, and yeah, I think that there are certain lessons that China has internalized from history and others less so, right? So I think the policy conditionality question I was mentioning before, right? They sort of, from my perspective, miscalculated, right? With trying to use commodities and natural resources to undergird and securitize these investments instead. That being said, I think in terms of their overall strategy, in terms of internationalizing their firms and maximizing their market space, this is where the very long, patient approach has benefited them greatly, because they've been able to expand a commercial footprint over a very short period of time, globally, 15 or 20 years. And the way they've done that is to use this massive banking system they have domestically and subsidize a lot of sort of this external activity in order to create, right, this new market space. And I think that that strategically has been very successful. And certainly sort of when we look at the commercial conditions, less oriented towards mitigating risk and more oriented towards expanding commercial commerce, right, or commerce internationally, they've done quite well. In terms of managing the debt, and then I'll move on to Diego's question, right, I think they're toggling in both directions, bilateral and multilaterally, right? And this is the source of the new book as well. And I think to some extent, they're willing to use multilateral institutions if it means, right, that perhaps there's a greater likelihood of being repaid, but also perhaps if it's less of a strategically important sector that's at stake, right? So I think in a case where, it's less important strategically for them, they're more than willing to kind of let multilateral institutions take the lead. I think when there's sort of more of a question in terms of bilateral commercial space, they're more likely to use bilateral loans. I think sort of, importantly, from this point too, there was the earlier question too about, okay, well, what then, once you've kind of moved into these kind of spaces, then how do you protect those investments over time? What do you do? And there's the point about, bilaterally, China has to step in at the last minute. There's a Reinhardt paper, right, that Victoria was referencing before. I think importantly, yes, that's happening with the bilateral discretion to some extent. And we certainly see that in places like Argentina, where it's able to boost reserves and help Argentina weather a storm. And counterfactually, you can make an argument, if there was more of a crisis, maybe more quickly, maybe there have to be more reform to some extent. I think importantly, however, and I think it's a very important caveat in terms of the Reinhardt paper, is all these swap lines are in renminbi. So renminbi alone doesn't get you there. It has to be converted to dollars, right? And I think that's a point that's missing from that paper, and that in the Argentine case, it's converted, right? But a lot of these swap loans aren't necessarily converted. Moving over to Diego's 2 points, right? In terms of the United States, how's the United States dealing with this? There's lots of interest, not surprisingly, but also I think there is limited resources on some extent, right? So we see efforts like the Development Finance Corporation to encourage private firms to seek out more market space internationally, and doing that through sort of support of private equity and such things. But there's not a lot being done to try to boost sort of the telecommunications imprint internationally, or boost the more creative use of resources in order to spur markets internationally. I think there's lots of interest in order to do that, but when talking to people, State Department or USAID or other places, there's limitations in terms of how they can use the resources, where often it has to be kind of private sector led. So I think that this is a kind of a really important feature in that I think there's lots of political will to do something, but there doesn't seem to be as much in terms of resources and the ability to do something, particularly given that the private sector so often takes the lead, in the United States compared to the state, right? So that in itself can be a constraint on these institutions. And in terms of the reemergence of BRICS, to flag another paper I've been working on is sort of to what extent can you externalize the China model to other countries? The bottom line of that paper is, well, no one quite has the scale of the Chinese banking sector, so it's very difficult to replicate this model. But at the same time, what we see countries like India and Brazil doing is on a firm level, like more traditional sort of development banking, there is an effort to kind of expand international firms' presence and expand sort of their operations internationally, but much more on a firm level. It's much more firm driven rather than market driven, as was the case in China.
Okay, thank you, everybody. This brings us to the close of our session. We are out of time, and I would like to appreciate your presence, questions from the audience, and in particular, of course, Stephen's presentation and Victoria's comments. Thank you for being here. And once again, congratulations, Stephen, on the great book.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, everybody who joined us online.